Thank you all for joining us on this first ever Genetic Counselor Awareness Day. We are excited to bring to you this month's November NSGC member webinar. Today's webinar will be titled Blazing the Trail, Why Genetic Counselors Must Lead the Genomics Revolution. We encourage questions to be asked throughout this presentation. As a courtesy to our presenters, all attendees have been muted at this time. Please utilize the chat function box at the bottom of your Zoom panel to submit any questions that you may have to our speaker today. Questions will be allowed at the last 10 minutes of the webinar, so please feel free to keep those coming throughout the webinar. We'll bring them to you. Today's learning objectives for the webinar are to explain the speaker's career trajectory and the successes, failures, and challenges she has faced as a genetic counselor. She will discuss how genetic counselors must position themselves and our field as leaders in order for our profession to move forward, and examine why genetic counselors must lead the genomics revolution and how genetic counselors can and must do so. At this time, I will turn it over to Sandra Peacock, who will introduce our speaker today.
Hello, everyone, and hope everyone's having a wonderful Genetic Counselor Awareness Day. We are honored and excited to have Ellen Matloff as our inaugural speaker for Genetic Counselor Awareness Day. When she was nominated by the board as a speaker, we all recognized her as an excellent example of a GC blazing the trail. Ellen is a master's level certified genetic counselor and the president and CEO of MyGeneCounsel, a digital health company that helps clinicians and consumers understand, track, and utilize their genetic testing information. She received her BS in biology from Union College in New York and her MS in genetic counseling from Northwestern Medical School in Chicago. She founded the Yale Cancer Genetic Counseling Program, serving as its director for 18 years. She was also the lead plaintiff in the BRCA gene patent case of 2013 that went to the United States Supreme Court. Ellen has authored more than 50 scientific publications, book chapters, and a book. She's a media consultant and lectures worldwide on genetic counseling, medical ethics, and the issues facing women in science and business. And now on to Ellen.
Thank you, Sandra, for the kind introduction. Kickoff speaker for the event, and thank the National Society of Genetic Counselors for the invitation. Students and graduate students pursuing the field of genetic counseling. My title today is entitled Blazing the Trail, Why Genetic Counselors? And so I'm going to talk to you about my goals for this presentation. To put the box for all of us, and to push all of us outside of our comfort. Is number one. Can we have the quiz? In the past 5 years, have you ever felt that you didn't receive the recognition you deserved because you were a genetic counselor and not an MD or a PhD? Please vote. I think we will populate answers immediately. So yes, in the past 5 years, 84% of you have felt that you didn't receive the recognition you deserved because you were a genetic counselor. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today and things that we can do moving forward to change that metrics. Today, I'm going to share some of the challenges from my personal journey in genetic counseling from the past 20 years. The first challenge I encountered was actually on one of my graduate school interviews, when the director of the program said to me, "Your grades and your board scores are very high. Why didn't you go to medical school instead of graduate school for genetic counseling?" That was a light bulb moment for me. I'd never thought that idea before. And when I brought this question up during a subcommittee call before this lecture, one of the other members who said she'd gone to graduate school in the 1980s said she thought that sounded more like a question that would have been brought up then. But a more recent graduate, someone who graduated in the last 10 years, said that she'd faced a similar question on one of her graduate school interviews. So one of the things I'd like us to consider today is, why would we ask a question like that of students going to graduate school for genetic counseling? And what message is that conveying to people interested in our field? The second thing that I encountered was at my first job out of graduate school. I thought I had been quite savvy in negotiating my contract and had tried to negotiate for as high a salary as possible, but was told by the administrator that I had peaked out based on my years of experience, which at that point was 0, for how much money I could make. It wasn't until I left that job 2 years later and saw the papers from my classification that I realized they had classified me as a genetic counseling assistant, and that all you needed to do that was have 1 year as an undergraduate in biology, even though I had my master's degree in genetic counseling and had completed all of my necessary internships. And so I learned an important lesson that day about negotiating for positions, so that when I negotiated for my second job, I got a little bit smarter, and I asked for a lot of things in writing, not only my travel stipend and my education CEU stipend, as well as my salary, but I asked to have in writing that I would have a private office with a door. When I arrived at that job the first day, I was told that they didn't have a private office for me. And it was one of the first times that I faced an important challenge, which is, do I stand up for myself now? And if so, what impact will that have on my relationships at this brand new job? Now, keep in mind that I'd obviously resigned from my first job. I'd moved to a new state, and I had signed a lease for a year on an apartment. But I felt it was important to stand my ground. And so I told my boss that we had a written agreement and that I would work from home until the office space I'd been promised was ready for me. It didn't necessarily make me popular that first day at the job or the first week at the job, but I felt it was important to stick with our agreed upon terms. A few months later, I was told that we would be having a grand rounds on cancer genetic counseling and testing, which at the time was a very new field. And I was asked to prepare the grand rounds, prepare all of the slides using case examples that I had seen in clinic, and also prepare the script that went along with those slides. But I was informed that I would not be allowed to present at grand rounds because genetic counselors don't present at rounds. I was again faced with a dilemma and decided to tell my supervisors that because I was going to prepare the slides and the script, and these were all the patients I had seen, that I would like to give the rounds or at least take part in the rounds, or I would not be preparing the rounds. And so I was allowed to co-present at that rounds, and interestingly enough, from then on, genetic counselors were allowed to present and presented many times over the coming decades. A few years later, I had an idea for a grant and wrote up the grant myself, and was then told at the last moment that I'd have a better chance to get the grant if I put an MD as the PI on the grant, even though he had not been at all involved in the project. I decided to instead use a granting agency that did not require an MD or a PhD to be the PI, and I remained as the principal investigator on that grant and was able to secure a grant for $250,000, which helped to advance my career. A few years later, when I had many publications under my belt and a lot of other achievements at my institution, I asked for faculty status. And I was told that genetic counselors are not faculty grade. And so I pushed the issue, and I was told that I could apply for faculty status at the nursing school, which was interesting because I was located at the medical school. I taught at the medical school, and everything else I did was at the medical school. I had no relationship with the nursing school, which was several miles away. I persisted. I asked a champion of mine within the institution to go to bat for me. He did. And I was eventually granted faculty status, although again, this was a very difficult hurdle to jump over. And then a few years later, I came across by accident some data indicating that the other directors of shared resources, which was my title, at my institution were making a lot more money than I was making. And so I decided, I looked at the professional status survey for NSGC, and I realized that these other directors were making a lot more than the professional status survey reflected. And so I went to my then boss in the cancer center and laid out my accomplishments over the past decade and mentioned that I had seen the salary of other shared resource directors and asked that I be given a salary commensurate with my responsibilities and my achievements. And I didn't give a number. And several months later, they came back to me after committee and raised my salary by $35,000, far more than I would have ever asked for myself. Even late in the game, after I'd been on the job for 17 years, there were still challenges that came up. One of these challenges occurred when a patient was referred to me who was 47 years old, of Latina ancestry, and had a triple negative breast cancer. And she was already scheduled for lumpectomy and radiation therapy. And with the referral from the surgeon, who was a visiting surgeon from outside the country, who had never worked with a genetic counselor before, he had written on the referral, no family history. When I took the patient's family history, in fact, she had no contact with her biological father and no information about any of her paternal relatives or their family history. I asked her if she tested positive for a mutation in the genes we were testing for that day, BRCA1 and 2, would it change her decision-making? Would she opt for a different surgery? And in fact, yes, she said she would opt for a bilateral mastectomy with immediate reconstruction and would forego radiation. I therefore suggested that we couldn't do a risk assessment on her because we were missing half of her family history, and that she may want to postpone her surgery until we had her test results, which would have been about 10 days later. So she did. I was then called in to a meeting with the surgeons at my institution, and I thought it was about a different topic. But when I got there, this particular visiting surgeon expressed his fury that a genetic counselor had said something to a patient that had made her postpone her surgery when she was at such low risk with no family history. I was taken off guard. I was flustered. I explained that, in fact, I took her pedigree and we didn't know half of her family history. He argued with me, argued that she was at low risk and that I had no business talking to this patient about postponing surgery. 2 weeks later, this patient came back with a BRCA1 mutation, and I sent a memo to all of the surgeons at that meeting and several other key figures, just letting them know that, in fact, it had been appropriate to postpone that surgery. I'm also going to speak to you today about my involvement in the gene patent lawsuit, as well as the challenges of starting my own company. In the late 1990s, we learned that there were patents on the genes BRCA1 and BRCA2 when our laboratory received a cease and desist letter saying that we could no longer perform this testing. We had to send our testing out, the cost of testing rose, and I felt this was having a negative impact on both patient care and clinical research. I began talking to colleagues about this, writing about it on our listserv, and trying to publish papers on this topic with limited success on all fronts. In fact, I wrote an opinion piece to one of the most competitive medical journals in the world. In a move I'd never heard of or seen of before, the editor wrote me back a short note telling me how utterly ridiculous my argument was. So ridiculous that he did not send my piece out for review and was instead returning it to me. How I wish I'd kept his note. I was embarrassed, but I persevered. I contacted several patent law experts to see if any of them would take the case pro bono. Several were interested, but the case did not pass their conflict of interest boards. I didn't know it then, but I was beginning a long quest to fight these patents. A colleague told me that she had seen the well-known ethicist Art Caplan on 60 Minutes and that he was against gene patents. She suggested that I contact him. I found his email address online and I sent him a message asking if he'd like to be a co-author on an opinion piece on the topic. Much to my surprise, he wrote back and agreed to review a draft. He made some artful edits and we submitted. With his name and influence, our paper was not only published, but landed on the cover of the Journal of the American Journal of Bioethics, sparking international debate on this topic. Note to self, don't ever be afraid to reach out to a famous expert regarding advice or a collaboration. The worst they can do is delete your message. A few years later, I received an invitation from the ACLU to join their lawsuit fighting gene patents. They had the money, the resources, and the brain power to make it happen. Of interest, not everyone was so happy about this lawsuit or my involvement in it. At one point, I was invited to leave the NSGC listserv if I didn't stop talking about this case. My institution told me that I would need to file as a private citizen and could not mention my affiliation. It was intimated that I could potentially lose my job because of my involvement, and I was advised to get a private attorney to guide me, which I did. My closest advisors told me that my involvement in the lawsuit was too risky and that I should not do it, but I had to. With the unanimous verdict, we were able to bring down gene patents at the US Supreme Court in June of 2013. The outcome was positive, and this is what most people remember, the endpoint, the victory. What they may not know is that this was a very long, lonely, and unpopular journey. I did not win any popularity contests along the way, and I found that this is often the way when it comes to big challenges. So one question you may be asking yourself, and I'll tell you I ask myself this almost every day, is why do I stand up for myself, for our patients, for our colleagues, for our field? Do I enjoy conflict? No, I do not. Were these battles difficult? Yes, and scary, and uncomfortable, and awkward. Did I worry that I was being labeled a troublemaker? Yes, and I can most definitely tell you I was. Did I always win? Absolutely not. So why did I do it? I heard a quote a long time ago that resonated with me. Would you rather be liked or respected? For the most part, I have chosen respected. And for the most part, this has been the right decision for me professionally. And it has helped me stand up for myself, for our patients, and for my colleagues and students when need be. The last personal challenge I'll discuss today is the one that led me to start my own company. My clinical group noticed that many patients in our area were having genetic testing without the involvement of a genetic counselor. We saw errors in result interpretation. Patients who had prophylactic surgeries they didn't need, others diagnosed with late cancers because they were told their genetic test results were negative when in fact they were not. We did a national call for cases and published 3 articles documenting other cases like ours, the first in 2010, I might add. And these cases were from all over our country and also from Canada. We realized that result misinterpretation is common and that it was causing harm. It was then that I came up with an idea. A way to create and provide digital genetic counseling reports tied to test results. I chose to leave my secure job of 18 years to start my own company, MyGeneCounsel. Some of you have asked what we do at MyGeneCounsel, and so I will briefly tell you. At MyGeneCounsel, we provide a secure HIPAA-compliant platform for patients and for providers, and they receive digital test results linked to their specific test result. They can then get some very basic information that reads much like a genetic counseling session, and they can scroll through and answer the questions most important to them. We've brought patient advocates in from the beginning, and this is powered by all of you, by genetic counselors. There's also a clinician stream with parallel points to the patient portal, a direct view into the patient portal, and it's all based on evidence-based, fully referenced streams. And it's easy to understand and implement. One important feature of MyGeneCounsel is push notifications. So both the patient and the clinician receive a push notification when variants are reclassified by the laboratory, as clinical information updates, and when clinical trial opportunities become available. For those of you who might be interested in more information, you can go to our website at mygenecounsel.com and scroll down to the bottom of the page to sign up for updates. I will tell you that starting my own company has been my most challenging hurdle to date, but very exciting. Quiz number 2. Many healthcare providers play integral roles on our team, but this question, do you believe that certified genetic counselors are best qualified to provide genetic counseling, is asking one question. Do you believe that our graduate level training in science, counseling, and communications makes us uniquely qualified to provide genetic counseling services? I'm waiting on pins and needles here for your answers. Please vote. So 95% of you do believe that we are the best qualified to provide genetic counseling services. So of course, that's the vast majority of us. And I'm glad to hear that. I do want to talk about some of the ways that we do and do not convey that message. So in addition to being in a rich environment for opportunity, the field of genetic counseling also faces some challenges. As a whole, as you know, our membership is mostly young and mostly female. Add to that we are not MDs and are in a relatively new subspecialty in the healthcare space, and it's not difficult to see why genetic counselors continue to have to carve out meaningful roles and leadership opportunities in 2017. One of the issues at play here, in my opinion, is asserting our expertise. Let me show you a recent example. Many of you saw that a lawsuit was recently filed. A woman had an unnecessary mastectomy and hysterectomy based on a mistaken diagnosis. Let me make it clear that I'm not involved in this case. I have not spoken to this patient and have no information regarding her personal or family history beyond what has been published in the popular press. But for those of you who haven't read about this case reported on October 19th of this year, this woman apparently had genetic testing without the help of a genetic counselor. She was reportedly told that she had Lynch syndrome and encouraged to have her uterus and breasts removed. Her test results reportedly showed that she tests negative for pathogenic findings in BRCA1, BRCA2, and the Lynch syndrome genes. She had a variant of uncertain significance in MLH1. So again, with the disclaimer that we do not have access to her personal or family history, it appears that not one, but two errors may have been made here. Number one, the patient had a variant of uncertain significance and not a pathogenic variant. And number two, the patient was advised to have a bilateral mastectomy for Lynch syndrome. There was an interesting discussion about this case and that the role a genetic counselor could have played in preventing these errors on Twitter. Let me say that I've spoken to the next three counselors I'll discuss during this example, and I very much appreciate their willingness to allow me to share their tweets and their off-the-cuff responses. Let's discuss how these responses may play into how genetic counselors see themselves and how we communicate in a public forum. Scott of Chicago Genetics posted the story in this tweet early on, beyond unfortunate story about MDs misinterpreting genetic test results and doing unnecessary and wrong surgery. I responded with a direct quote from one of the articles indicating that doctors at Curry Medical Practice never directed her to a genetic counselor who could explain her cancer risks and test results. Carrie responded with, as an expert witness, I can attest that genetic counselors make errors too. No one is perfect, so need better systems. Dangerous, in my opinion, to have genetic counselors be a savior. Followed by, that being said, I used to call my GC team the lawsuit prevention brigade to justify more full-time employees to hospital administration. A past genetics summer fellowship graduate of mine, Marjan, who will earn her MBA this spring, responded with, we have patients demand prophylactic surgery because of supposedly positive results, but our surgeons always ask for help to find the records and interpret. We need a multidisciplinary team when caring for patients. Rural providers need easier access to multidisciplinary specialists. We're all responsible for this. As I mentioned, I contacted these counselors who were kind enough to speak with me in advance of this talk to ask about their tweets and their general feeling about the role of genetic counselors in preventing errors such as this, and how they felt about asserting their expertise as the experts in genetic counseling. First, a reminder that Twitter limits us to 140 characters per tweet, or at least they did at this time, it's now expanded, and that these tweets often occur spontaneously in reaction to current events. With that being said, I received some very interesting feedback. One counselor questioned whether our training and non-directiveness may blend into our day-to-day work life and our overall approach, making counselors a bit non-directive and firmly carving out the critical nature of our services in the healthcare team. Another pointed out that, as genetic counselors, we sometimes doubt ourselves and that it might be hard to question a surgeon or a member of the team and say, we want to review the actual test results, but that we must, in a respectful way, we must be the champions for our patients. A third said that we don't want to come across as holier than thou or make the solution simpler than it is. Genetic counseling will not solve all problems, and there are many, including access to care, insurance coverage, and sociological and public health issues. That being said, genetic counselors must internalize our own value. We need to take leadership and ownership of our worth. More broadly, instead of just advocating for patients, we must also advocate for ourselves. Interesting, because patient advocate Amy Byer-Shainman wrote, why certified genetic counseling is crucial. MyGeneCounsel has written on this. Our patient advocate partners are not shy about advocating for genetic counseling and saying that it should be provided by genetic counselors and that we can prevent errors. Dr. Corey from the CDC feels the same. Genetic counseling is crucial before and after genetic testing. I also learned something from this situation. I learned that we have to make sure our message is conveyed, because in a few review articles after the case was published, a few medical experts talked about how patients could avoid having their test results misinterpreted. I was surprised and very disturbed to see that in many of them, genetic counseling was either not mentioned at all or misspelled and glossed over as a service that may or may not help a patient having genetic testing. I was angry at myself for not being the one writing the paper, so I did write one. Why I'm not surprised that a woman had unnecessary removal of breasts and uterus. This was a reminder to me, and I hope it will serve as a reminder to all of you, that we must be the voice of reason here. We are the experts in this area. We must make our voices heard. Again, with the help of our patient advocates, Lisa Gazzardi, thank you, MyGeneCounsel, for this timely advice regarding misinterpreted genetic testing results. Never underestimate the power of genetic counseling. A few other tweets from genetic counselors on separate but related topics. Leslie saying, the lack of informed consent or even knowledge of the test is bad, but it really scares me how surgical decisions are happening due to results. Andrea, I feel like this has to become less and less of an excuse. Too many remote genetic counselors and labs offering GC access. A phone gets you GC access. And she was referring to the claim that there aren't enough genetic counselors for all patients to be seen. I also contacted a past graduate of the Cancer Genetics Fellowship, Megan Farmer, for her input. Megan will finish her MBA this December. Some of the insights I will share came from Megan and the other counselors I interviewed. But first, I'd like to take a step back. Let's talk about the percentage of students accepted to different types of graduate programs. The acceptance rate for law school is somewhere between 8% for the highest tier schools, like Yale and Stanford, and as high as 70% for some of the less competitive law schools. So about a 40% overall acceptance rate. The acceptance rate overall for medical school is about 35 to 40%. But in the United States, approximately 8 to 13% of applicants to graduate school in genetic counseling are accepted. Why do I make this point? It is not easy to become a genetic counselor or even to be accepted into graduate school for genetic counseling. In fact, it is highly competitive. We attract some of the best and brightest minds to the field of genetic counseling, and that will only continue as the field of genomics explodes. We are also in an area of rapid job growth, even as compared to other areas of healthcare. Growth in our field will also accelerate over the next decade. However, there is still much room for improvement in the areas of salaries for genetic counselors. As you can see, the NSGC Professional Status Survey shows a slightly higher salary, averaging at about $82,000, but we can and we will do better in compensating genetic counselors in the next decade. Now is the time to act, when genetic counselors are in very high demand. Why genetic counselors must lead the genomics revolution? Genetics has the potential to improve almost every area of medical care: prenatal, cancer, cardiac, pediatric, adult, pharmacogenetics, and many other areas, but only if the testing is ordered, interpreted, and conveyed accurately. Without this step, such testing may do more harm than good. Genetic counselors are critical in maximizing the potential of genetic testing and minimizing the harm. Genetic counselors have the unique skill set necessary to do this job. We understand genomics. We can communicate that message to clinicians and patients. and we can assist in utilizations. We have fierce patient advocacy skills. We have the ability to learn quickly and to grow our expertise. Look around. Genetic counselors are incredible. We are everywhere doing everything. Academic medical centers, large and small hospitals, health networks, laboratories, insurance companies, local and national government agencies, genetic testing companies, genetic counseling companies, private practices, industry, and startups. We're counseling patients, writing content, writing policies, giving lectures, doing utilization management, grant writing, administration, and innovation. I recently spoke, well, actually, I was recently listening to a webinar, a cancer genetics webinar, in which a genetic counselor was reviewing a journal article from a highly rated article. And I watched as she went through this article and pointed out several errors that were made in the article, missed by the journal and missed by the reviewers. And I had one of those, boy, we're smart moments about how smart genetic counselors are. I also recently spoke to a woman in a company looking at circulating tumor DNA and how this could have potential for patients, oncologists, and the field of cancer moving forward. I've spoken to genetic counselors doing laboratory utilization, making sure that clinicians are ordering the right tests for their patients, saving their institutions hundreds of thousands of dollars, and helping both patients and clinicians. I also yesterday spoke to 2 genetic counselors who've started a business and are mastering the business world. Later in the day, I spoke to a genetic counselor who is high up in management of a genetic testing company, and another doing private counseling, taking on the direct-to-consumer marketplace. Genetic counselors are doing amazing things. We are critical to the success of the genomics revolution. What can we do collectively to drive the field forward? And so this is where I'm going to be brutally honest. As a profession, we can no longer be blind to the very real influences that are impacting healthcare and industry around genomics. We need to measure our value. How is our value recognized and compensated? We can no longer ignore the money and be embarrassed or intimidated by talking about the financial side of genetic counseling. This means that we are going to need to expand our skill set outside of genetics. We need to become more business savvy, and this means all of us in academic settings, hospitals and offices, private practice, and certainly in industry. If you don't do this, someone else will. Genetic counselors need to be in the driver's seat. The good news is that we can do this. We're smart, we're good at learning, and we have great attention to detail. We need to educate ourselves on topics outside of genetics, business, accounting, marketing, finance, administration. We need to develop relevant CEUs for genetic counselors within these topic areas. For those of you in the position to do so, develop free CEUs for genetic counselors in these areas. Get a grant. Do it as your master's study. There are several grants and opportunities available through NSGC. We also will need to work these skills into our tool set in our graduate training programs. We're also going to need to expand our skill set within genomics. And I think genetic counselors already do an incredible job at this, but there's a twist. So you already know how to become the expert at your institution, how to counsel patients with a new prenatal test that's on the market, or in counseling patients with whom a germline result was found during somatic testing. You've already figured these things out. But reach out to your colleagues in different departments: pathology, laboratory utilization, malpractice management, and develop a new collaboration, a new clinic, a new tool. Then add it to your resume. Advocate for a higher salary. Fight for yourself. Advocate for yourself. with the same vigor you would advocate for a patient. Genetic counseling and testing has changed, and it will keep changing. We need to flex with those changes, to innovate, and to lead the changes. You are the ones in the trenches. You know where the gaps are. You know how to fix them. Be the innovator. Be the leader. You have the knowledge. You have the skills. Assert yourself. We also need to pool our resources. Some of you have already had these conversations at your institutions or companies, and you've been successful. Let's share our experiences, our approaches, even our materials. What has worked for you? How can it be applied to other settings? We need to strategize, to mobilize, and to work together. Be part of the movement. What can we do individually? Number one, internalize your own value. Teach this to our students, to our colleagues. You, as genetic counselors, in my opinion, are by far the best qualified to order genetic testing, interpret genetic test results, provide genetic counseling as a whole. Clearly, there are many other health team members who are part of that process, but no one else provides genetic counseling as you do. Stand up for yourself, politely, professionally, but firmly. Stand up for all of us. Identify yourself as a genetic counselor first. Our president, Mary Freivogel, suggested this during one of her speeches, and it made me think. I had president and CEO listed first on all of my social media platforms, but she inspired me to be a genetic counselor first. Join me. Bring us the best students. We already have fantastic students. I'm working with many of them. Many of you are working with them. Some of you are those students. You're listening today. We need more. This means we need you to go out and let people know about our field. I saw that Heather Hampel is spending today's day giving a lecture to 7th graders about the field of genetic counseling, and I thought, what better activity for this day? Go out there, lecture in colleges, but also high schools, middle schools, even elementary schools. Graduate students, this means you. Contact your college, your high school, offer to go back and give a lecture about genetic counseling. I will tell you that some of my very brightest moments have been when genetic counselors have contacted me and said, I heard you speak to my college. I heard you speak to my high school. It's a wonderful feeling. Bring us the best and the brightest. Let me back up one and say, let me take this one extra step. And this one is tricky. Of course, we need to make sure that we reach out to ethnic minorities, students interested in tech and business, as well as STEM. We don't need to limit this to students who know they're interested in genetics. Make sure you reach out to boys and men. We need these students for the obvious reasons that it will strengthen and diversify our field and result in better patient care and a richer, more balanced professional society. But there's another plus. Men get paid more than women do. Yep, that's right. Bring the men into our field and raise the pay scales for all of us. We will do this in parallel with also advocating for better salaries for all of us. Number 5, support other genetic counselors. I'd like to yell this from the rooftop. Support other genetic counselors within your own institution, within your own state, and via social media networks worldwide. Importantly, support companies that value genetic counselors. Take a look at that company's profile online. Do they have a genetic counselor in the C-level suite, meaning CEO, COO, CMO, CFO, CTO? Or are their genetic counselors buried on page 4 of their profile, even though they claim to be a genomics company? I always get a real kick out of that. There are a few companies founded, led, and fueled by genetic counselors. Support those that exist. Like them on Facebook. Follow them on Twitter. Buy their products. Send your business their way. Tell others you know about those companies. Support and work with our patient advocates. I'm going to get on a soapbox here. Our patient advocates in all of these disease areas are out there spreading the word about genetic counseling and testing all of the time. We need to be appreciating these patient advocates, supporting them, and working with them. Like their tweets, retweet their tweet, comment on their tweet, thank them for their tweet, go to their Facebook post, spread their Facebook post, comment on it. And more importantly, we need to invite them to our national meetings as our guests. We need to give them platforms to speak and to educate us on the things that they know and they do best. And there are a lot of those things. They are some of our biggest fans. We need to be theirs. Okay, I'm exhausting myself with my vigor here. Quiz number 3. Do you actively follow and support genetic counseling and genomics activities via social media, as in Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn? We probably have a skewed audience here since all of you are watching this on a webinar, but let's see how this pans out. 64% of you are using social media to support genetic counseling and genomics activity. And so I'm going to ask you, for those of you in the no category, that's 36% of you, we need you. We need your voices. Join. It's free. It's easy. It takes just a few minutes a day. It doesn't have to dominate your life. For those of you saying you don't know how to use these platforms, it's easy. Ask a 12-year-old. They'll show you how to do it. Don't just like materials. Retweet them. Comment. Share them. Students, this means you too. Be part of the movement. The future has never looked brighter for genetic counselors. In the past 40 years, the field has grown, changed, and flourished, and there are more opportunities, jobs, and potential for growth than ever before. We have the founders of our field to thank for this, as well as the NSGC, the ABGC, ASHG, and our colleagues in other fields who have supported our growth. I would also like to thank all of you who have served on committees and in the leadership roles of these organizations for helping us move forward. The field of genomics is bright, and we are the thought leaders who will lead the revolution forward. To all genetic counselors listening to me today, you are needed. You are relevant. You are the future. And here's what I'm asking of you today. Dream the change. Be the change. Lead the change. All of you know this quote by Robert Frost. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that has made all the difference. Being a genetic counselor, you chose the road less traveled. You chose the field many people still haven't heard of. You've had to prove your value, to stand up for yourselves and our patients, and to explain the value of genomics and genetic testing every single day. I'm going to ask you to take one more step, because sometimes neither of the existing paths work. It is then that you take out your machete and you cut a third path. Genomics is about to become a part of everyday life for every person. The third path does not yet exist. I'm asking you to grab your machetes and to help me cut the third path. Thank you for your attention. It's been both a pleasure and an honor to join you on this first ever Genetic Counseling Awareness Day. And I look forward to hearing your questions and comments.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ellen, so much for sharing your story and for joining us today for Genetic Counselors Awareness Day. We are now going to open it up for questions. So for everyone joining us today, please use the chat box located at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions for Ellen. With that, we do have our first question. As someone with an incredible career path so far, what can we expect from you next in your career?
So, as I mentioned, I'm the president and CEO of MyGeneCounsel, and I am lucky enough to have brought Danielle Bonadies, also a genetic counselor, on with me to start MyGeneCounsel. And we work now with about 25 of you out in the field developing this digital content. And so, what can you expect from me in the future? Well, you can expect this company to grow and develop and to bring many more of you into the fold. And I'm hoping that someday soon, MyGeneCounsel will be right up there with Google and Yahoo in terms of companies you've heard of.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, what is your best piece of advice for a current GC program applicant?
We've actually written several pieces on this. You can find them on the blog of our website, and we went to the program directors to ask for advice. I guess my advice personally would be a lot of genetic counseling applicants don't realize that so many of their skills can impact their worth as genetic counselors. Maybe you've done some social media work as a summer job, or maybe you have some coding experience. All of those things are so valuable. So go back, look at your coursework, look what you've done for summer jobs, look at your internship experience. It all ties in. Think outside the box, be yourself, bring all of yourself to your application.
Wonderful, thank you. Our next question asks you a bit more about all the different mentors that you've had in your life. So you did mention that mentors were an important part of your career path here so far. So how do you go about finding those mentors, and what recommendation could you give to those joining us today?
So when I think of mentors, I think back to my high school biology teacher, Linda Turry, who also that's where I started learning about genetics. And then one of my college professors, Karen Williams, who taught me about genetics at the college level and steered me toward genetic counseling. In terms of my genetic counseling mentors, one of the most important for me was Terry Newtell-Leffler, who now herself is a professor at Northwestern. And then I've had many, many mentors in the field, both within and outside of genomics, including Vince DeVita, who is the director of Yale Cancer Center and who's on our board. But I've also reached out to mentors, and this is something I would encourage all of us to do, is that with the help of social media, you can reach out to anyone. Don't be afraid to write to someone and to say, I've read your paper. I have seen your lecture. I've watched your work. I saw your YouTube video. And let them know that you enjoyed their work. Ask if, you don't have to say, will you be my mentor, but ask if you can go meet with them for the day or talk to them on the phone for an hour. Don't limit yourself by geography anymore. And also don't limit yourself by fear. I think most people are really eager to help out students and people developing in the profession.
Great, thank you. What tips do you have for a genetic counselor who is working alone in a large system in order to increase awareness, particularly when a department tends to be, losing money or perhaps barely breaking even?
I think that one thing that we as genetic counselors don't do is sometimes we don't sing our own praises. And so I would encourage everyone, keep a list of the things that you're doing. If you have some cases that you can point to and say, in this case, I counseled this patient, and here was the outcome, and here was the outcome we avoided. You can talk about, how this saved in terms of malpractice premiums, how you may be protecting other people in the practice by providing these services. Also, don't be afraid to take a case like the one I showed you that was in the national news and ask to present it at case conference and say that if a genetic counselor had been on that team, how it could have saved those clinicians and those practices this lawsuit. You really need to sing your own praises, and I know that's difficult for many genetic counselors to do, but again, advocate for yourself the way you would advocate for a patient.
How can GCs get more involved in ensuring that genetics resources and services are offered equitably and don't exacerbate differences in health outcomes?
Can you repeat the last part of that question, or maybe the whole question?
Sure. How can GCs get more involved in ensuring that genetics resources and services are offered equitably and don't exacerbate differences in health outcomes?
I see. So I think one way to do that would be to study that at your own institution. And so, for example, if you could show that your own institution, let's use cancer for an example, that the breakdown by ethnic and socioeconomic scales were 30, 30, 30, but here's what your referrals look like to genetic counseling, and it's not equitable across that line, that you need to make some changes. And I think that's number one, is increasing awareness. And then you can talk, and I would pull in patient groups in your area and see what you can do to raise awareness so that more patients are asking for genetic counseling. Where can you put signage? Where can you put information? Where can you give lectures that draw those groups in?
Great, thank you, Ellen. And we have time for one more question here. We've received some wonderful questions from your story here today on our webinar. So what we'll do is we will work to get answers to all of these questions after the webinar and post them online so that they can be available to all of our attendees. But our last question here would be, in terms of salary negotiation and asking for raises, how do you know when to stay the course and keep trying, or when it's time to leave for a new position?
So I would say that, and this is difficult, and I find this in the business world as well, that you have to stay the course, you have to keep asking. But one of the best ways to negotiate is to come back with another offer. And the thing is, you have to mean it. You have to mean that you would leave if they didn't match your salary. So if you're going to bring that up, make sure that you mean it and that you would leave if your salary is not matched. But if your institution won't work with you, that is one of the very best ways to negotiate. Try and be a hardliner. Put your business cap on. Take your counseling cap off, put it in the closet, put your business hat on, and be brutal. Go in there and negotiate for yourself.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to everyone that was able to join us for today's webinar. With that, that is the end of our webinar. And we just want to wish you all a happy Genetic Counselor Awareness Day. Thank you very much, Ellen, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.